Hard Tack and Coffee, A Soldier's Life in the Civil War is a classic memoir written by John D. Billings, first published in 1887. This engaging account provides a vivid and often humorous look into the daily lives of Union soldiers during the American Civil War. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Billings' words. Let's begin. The subject of this chapter is a deeply suggestive one for old soldiers, encompassing a wide range of experiences that would be nearly impossible to exhaust. However, much of these experiences were shared by most long-term veterans, and it is to these common experiences that I will address my attention. From the descriptions I have already given of the various types of shelter used by soldiers, it is clear they were most comfortably settled in their winter quarters. Each hut became a small homestead, possessing, for a time, many of the qualities of a home. The bunk, stools, and other furniture, along with the army bric-a-brac, whether captured or homemade, adorned the rough tenements both inside and out. These items took on sentimental value in the soldiers' minds, a value often unappreciated until the inevitable day when marching orders arrived, and the soldiers folded their tents to move on. This sketch will recount aspects of Army life as it unfolded after marching orders were received. When the commanding general of an army had finalized a campaign plan and determined the right time to act, orders were promptly issued to subordinate commanders. These instructions directed them to prepare their units to fall into column at a specified hour on a specified day. The orders passed down through corps, division, brigade, regimental, or battery headquarters until they reached the rank and file. Soldiers were typically instructed to be ready at the appointed time, equipped with 3 days' rations in their haversacks, a standard provision. Infantrymen were also to carry 40 rounds of ammunition in their cartridge boxes, though this amount was often exceeded. For instance, when the Army of the Potomac entered the wilderness, each man carried between 80 and 100 rounds of ammunition, stowed in knapsacks, haversacks, or pockets, depending on the available space. Additionally, they had 6 days' worth of rations packed in a similar manner. During the Chancellorsville campaign, under Hooker's command, troops were issued 11 days' rations. Marching orders sometimes arrived unexpectedly. I recall one particular incident on October 10, 1863, when the long roll suddenly sounded in the infantry camp near us. Our guns were promptly unlimbered for action just outside the camp, where we had been lying for several days, completely unaware of any imminent threat. This surprise was intentional, as General Lee was attempting to position his forces between our army and Washington. Although we were not attacked, we began retreating to the rear a few hours later. Before the start of a spring campaign, a reasonable amount of notice was generally provided. Each brigade had an orderly who almost always delivered the marching orders. The men quickly recognized the nature of the tidings when they saw him galloping toward regimental headquarters. Often, they would playfully mock him as he rode in and out of camp, voicing their dislike of his errand. The wiser soldiers, however, wasted no time returning to their quarters to begin packing. When marching orders were officially announced at night, the men were instructed to be ready the next morning at a specific hour, with tents struck and their gear prepared. Soldiers who had not yet decided what to take and what to leave would retire to their huts to sort through their belongings. Standing before 2 cherished items, a soldier could almost be heard muttering, "How happy could I be with either, were the other dear charmer away," as he struggled to choose between them, knowing that both could not be carried. The decision was a literal enactment of the survival of the fittest, a concept receiving deeper and more immediate consideration in one evening than Darwin himself might have given it over a longer period. Should he take the overcoat or the woolen blanket? Perhaps he decided to attempt carrying both for a while. He might leave the dress coat behind and opt for the more practical blouse. With 2 changes of flannels in his possession, he would don a clean set, discard the old, and take the spare. These government-issued flannels were often as rough as coarse sandpaper and shared a similar color. At the head of his bunk, the soldier would find a collection of old letters accumulated over the winter. These he would read through one by one, committing them to the flames with a sigh. Some were letters from home, while others came from acquaintances or even young women advertising in publications like the Waverly Magazine for Soldier Correspondents. These correspondents often described themselves as 18, of prepossessing appearance, with a good education, and offered to exchange photographs. Such letters, while amusing in retrospect, would also meet the fire as part of the soldier's preparations. After sorting through his belongings, the soldier would secure keepsakes such as photographs, placing them in inside pockets, and distribute other small mementos about his person. If he chose to use a knapsack, he would initially pack more than if he opted for the increasingly common practice of slinging his blankets, both woolen and rubber, rolled over his shoulder. This latter method, prevalent later in the war, allowed the same weight to be carried with less strain than a knapsack would impose. Assuming the orders arrived in the late afternoon or evening, the soldiers typically spent the night preparing. Sleep was rare on such occasions, as the usual rules of camp life were relaxed. After personal packing and destroying excess belongings, rations were distributed. Each company formed a line to march to the cookhouse, where they received their allocated hardtack, pork, coffee, and sugar. These rations had to be packed as efficiently as possible into haversacks or other available spaces. In the artillery, additional tasks included strapping sacks of grain, usually oats, onto the ammunition chests for the horses, greasing axles, selecting spare horses to replace any unfit for duty, and striking the tents of regimental headquarters and the cook tents. These, along with officers' baggage, were loaded onto wagons destined for the supply trains. In short, everything had to be prepared for the next day's march. After these preparations, campfires were lit, and soldiers gathered around them. The relaxed atmosphere drew even those who had hoped for some sleep before the march. Soon, the mood around the fires grew jovial. As the fires burned low and the soldiers huddled closer, someone would bring another armful of furniture from a hut to reignite the flames, pushing back the encircling crowd once more. Conversations, which might have grown somber with the dying fire, brightened again. Talk often turned to speculation about the coming campaign. The campfires became forums for volumes of amateur wisdom on strategy. Armchair generals abounded, each convinced they had the solution to victory. In hindsight, these moments highlight how little many actually knew of the broader movements taking place. Yet, in those hours before the march, the camaraderie and good humor provided a sense of unity that helped sustain the soldiers through the trials ahead. When the discussion about what the army should do next had run its course, someone would inevitably start a song. For at least an hour, familiar and popular tunes like John Brown's Body, Marching Along, The Red, White, and Blue, and Rally Round the Flag would echo across the campfires. Sung with great earnestness and enthusiasm, the chorus grew as men from neighboring fires joined in. The singing would continue until tired bodies and minds gave way, and one by one, the soldiers withdrew to their huts for a few precious hours of rest. These few hours, though short, were vital to prepare them for the toil of the next day. How merciful, one might think, is Providence, which keeps the future hidden from us, revealing it only one moment at a time. Among those cheerful voices around the campfire, some would likely fall silent forever before the week was over, their owners cold and lifeless in the stillness of death. Morning came all too quickly for those who had spent much of the night in merriment. At the sound of the bugle or drum, the soldiers were roused from their brief slumber. At the agreed-upon time, the general was sounded, a signal for the infantry. The infantry signal for the general was a call to action. As it sounded, every tent in the regiment was struck. Watching acres of canvas vanish in moments, transforming the landscape, was always a fascinating sight. This signal, however, was seldom used in the later stages of the war. Early in the conflict, when soldiers used Sibley, wedge, and wall tents, the tents had to be packed away in wagon trains, necessitating early wake-ups and organized strikes. However, with the adoption of the smaller shelter tents, carried by each man, the use of the general became rare, except after long encampments. Few things in army life were as frustrating as waiting hours in camp after the appointed time to march. Yet, this was more the rule than the exception. When the hour came and the stockades were vacated, they were often demolished to fuel campfires. Soldiers, finding themselves still in camp with nothing to do, often regretted their haste in breaking down their quarters. They realized too late that they could have lingered in their huts and made their wait more tolerable. The situation was made worse if rain began to fall or if night overtook them again. Shelter tents, which could have quickly recovered their demolished huts, offered little solace in such conditions. These delays were a severe test of the soldiers' patience and sometimes seemed to harm their morale more than an average chaplain could repair in days. Eventually, the waiting ended. The flags of Corps headquarters, borne behind the Corps commander and followed by his staff, finally appeared on the road. The bugler of the leading division sounded the call attention, signaling the column to form and officers to mount their horses. At the next call, forward, the regiments began their march, rifles shifted to right shoulder shift. Picture the scene as the column moved past, each element of the Corps headquarters telling its own story. The Corps commander, a major general, rode at the head, flanked by his staff. This group typically included an assistant adjutant general, an assistant inspector general, a topographical engineer, a commissary of musters, a commissary of subsistence, a judge advocate, several aides-de-camp, and others, depending on the needs of the command. These officers, often ranking from captain to colonel, represented the brain and nerve center of the Corps. In the Union Army, major generals commanded divisions, corps, or entire armies. However, in the Confederate service, armies of significance were commanded by lieutenant generals. As the column passed, the Corps headquarters flag could be seen. In February 1863, General Hooker decreed that Corps headquarters flag should have a blue swallowtail field with a white Maltese cross in the center, bearing the Corps number. However, this regulation seems to have been largely ignored. By the time of the Wilderness Campaign, each Corps headquarters displayed a blue swallow-tailed flag bearing its unique emblem in white, with the Corps number in red at the center. Here comes the 1st Division. At the head rides its commanding general and staff, followed by the color bearer carrying the division flag. If you are familiar with Corps badges, you will immediately recognize which Corps or division it is. The caps worn by the men tell the story, but the flags are equally clear in their identification. The flag carried is the 1st Division color, rectangular in shape. The Corps emblem is red on a white field for the 1st Division, white on a blue field for the 2nd, and blue on a white field for the 3rd. Each division took turns leading the Corps on the march, rotating daily. Now comes another headquarters, marked by a triangular flag carried by its color bearer. This is a brigade flag. On May 12, 1863, General Hooker issued an order prescribing the patterns for division flags and brigade flags. Brigade flags were triangular in shape, and their designs varied slightly depending on their division. For the brigades of the 1st Division, the Corps symbol appeared in red on a white field. The 1st Brigade had no additional markings, the 2nd Brigade had a blue stripe next to the staff, and the 3rd Brigade had a blue border 4 1/2 inches wide. In the 2nd Division, the Corps symbol appeared in white on a blue field. A red stripe next to the staff designated the 2nd Brigade, while a red border marked the 3rd. Similarly, the 3rd Division used the Corps symbol in blue on a white field, with red stripes or borders distinguishing its brigades. Whenever there was a 4th Brigade, it was identified by triangular blocks of color in each corner of its flag. The Chief Quartermaster of the Corps and the Chief of Artillery each had their own flags, as specified in the color plates. However, the arrangement of colors on the Chief Quartermaster's flag varied between Corps. Hooker's scheme for distinguishing Corps, Division, and Brigade headquarters remained in use until the end of the war. The brigades, like divisions, rotated their positions, taking turns in leading. Regiments within brigades also rotated positions, ensuring fairness in bearing the challenges of the lead. Further along is the headquarters of the Army, with its commanding general and his large staff moving to the front of the column. The flag carried here is the familiar Star-Spangled Banner. This served as General Meade's headquarters flag until General Grant joined the Army of the Potomac. When Grant adopted the flag, Meade switched to a lilac-colored swallowtail flag with a gold eagle enclosed in a wreath. You can count the regiments in the column by their United States colors. Some flags also display the names of battles in which the regiment fought. Initially, such inscriptions were allowed only by authority of the Secretary of War. However, volunteer regiments often inscribed battles on their flags without formal approval. Meanwhile, the Confederate battle flag was a blue saltire, adorned with stars, set on a red field. General Joe Johnston designed it after the First Battle of Bull Run. It is easy to identify where a regiment begins and ends. A regiment typically starts with a field officer and concludes with a mule. In earlier times, regimental baggage was transported in wagons, but now much of it is loaded onto mules, which are led by contraband laborers. The mule itself is barely visible beneath the burden of cooking utensils, mess gear, tent poles, a valise, and other equipment. 4 mules could carry the equivalent load of 1 army wagon. At the end of the brigade, you would often find 2 or 3 mules carrying headquarters supplies. The mule sometimes shared company with a cook, a man who seemed perpetually covered in flour and grease. These men often carried shabby knapsacks to complement the mule's burden. Army cooks were frequently drawn from soldiers who were not well suited for combat duties, yet they played an indispensable role in keeping the troops fed. At the rear of the division comes a light battery, possibly assigned to this portion of the corps for the campaign. This battery includes 6 brass Napoleons, 12-pounders, excellent for short-range destruction. It is followed by a battery of steel Parrott rifles, 3-inch guns designed for long-range accuracy but less effective at close quarters. Across the fields, the 2nd Division moves into position, looking much like the 1st. Its flags and soldiers create a striking spectacle in the sunlight, with polished muskets and uniforms gleaming. The column moves at a steady pace, taking time to fully form. If we wait long enough, the 3rd Division will pass by unless it has taken another route. As the day grows warmer, the heat and pace begin to take their toll on the men. The ground vacated by a brigade after a brief halt is often strewn with discarded items, blankets, coats, trousers, and other gear. Soldiers jettison what they can no longer bear to carry. I remember seeing acres of discarded items on May 4, 1864, as the 2nd Corps moved into the wilderness. Soldiers, especially new recruits, often overpacked. Seasoned veterans knew when to shed excess weight and did so quickly, often within the first mile of a march. On the first day out of camp, blistered feet became another challenge. Many soldiers paused to soak their feet in streams and, when necessary, walked barefoot with their shoes slung over their muskets. Crossing streams, whether by pontoon bridges or fording, added another layer of difficulty. Men would sometimes strip off most of their clothing to keep it dry, carrying their gear above their heads. Mishaps were common, particularly when currents were strong or bottoms treacherous. Cavalrymen often stationed themselves downstream to rescue those who lost their footing. When crossing at night, large fires were lit to guide the way. During Meade's retreat from Culpeper in October 1863, my company forded the Rappahannock after dark and camped nearby. Soldiers made light of the situation, laughing and cheering as they waded through the water. Occasionally, a stubborn mule would halt midstream, refusing to budge, much to the exasperation of its handler and the amusement of passing troops. The sight of the mule's defiance, coupled with the handler's desperate efforts, often turned frustration into shared humor for the column. That was a noisy night, and it has always amazed me that we remained undisturbed, with the enemy less than 3 miles up the river, as General Birney noted in his records. There was no stopping to wring out clothes after crossing the river. The order was simply, close up. And the sounds of movement filled the darkness. The dull rattle of equipment, the clinking of coffee dippers on canteens or buckles, the shuffle of the column moving forward, and the sharp cracks of drivers urging on belated mule teams continued until the gray light of morning appeared. The army on the march in a rainstorm was a different sight from one on a clear day. At the first sign of rain, each soldier would remove his rubber blanket from his roll or knapsack, throwing it over his shoulders and tying it securely in front. Some men used their shelter tents instead, though these made for poor substitutes. But there was no pleasure in marching through rain. If it settled the dust, it also unsettled everything else. In order to go into camp during such weather hardly improved matters, as the ground was sodden, fence rails were soaked, woolen blankets and hardtack in the haversack were damp, and nothing was more abundant, or more unwelcome, than water. I remember one night in particular when we camped on a hillside in Pleasant Valley, Maryland, during a torrential mountain downpour. With water streaming freely beneath me under a hastily pitched shelter, I lay down for the night. As a new soldier, the experience seemed dreadful and left a vivid impression. Later, such situations became so frequent they blurred into mere routine. The rain took its toll on the horses as well. Standing at the picket rope, pelted by rain, often made them restless and irritable. They seemed to prefer marching in harness to standing idle. The next day, however, they often faced grueling conditions. Mud and mire slowed everything down, and if 2 corps shared the same road after a storm, the 2nd fared far worse. Deep ruts and mud holes left by the 1st Corps made progress agonizingly slow. Artillery and caisson regularly became mired to their hubs, and no amount of shouting, swearing, or straining could free them until more horses were added to the teams. When the worst spots were encountered, fences by the roadside were torn down, and the column diverted into adjacent fields, returning to the road beyond the obstacle. At times, a staff officer would be stationed to guide artillery to safer passages, and during night marches, fires were built at critical points to light the way. The passage of the army through dust was equally remarkable. A long drought would turn the roads to powdery dust, and the march would stir it into suffocating clouds that hung heavily in the air. The dust coated everything, faces, uniforms, and equipment, and even found its way into canteens and haversacks. Men trudging in the middle or rear of the column were often completely obscured by the swirling haze, with only their coughing and shuffling audible through the murk. It seemed that the finer the weather, the worse the dust. When the army anticipated running into the enemy during its advance, flankers were deployed. These were single-file soldiers marching parallel to the column, spaced several feet apart. In open country, they kept a distance of 10 or 12 rods from the main body, but in wooded areas, they moved closer. Should an attack occur, the flankers on that side would immediately form the skirmish line for the action. When a column halted, the sight was striking. It dissolved in an instant as soldiers scattered to the sides of the road. Some sat down, leaning back on their knapsacks if they had them. Others stretched out full length on the ground. In wet or muddy conditions, cannoneers perched on their limber chests, while infantrymen might straddle their muskets if the halt was brief. For longer pauses, troops were massed into open areas. Muskets were stacked, equipment laid aside, and nearby fences were dismantled for campfires. Soon, coffee simmered, pork sputtered over the flames, and men refreshed themselves with rest and food before resuming the march. When the halt was brief, however, it stiffened the men's muscles. Weighed down by their equipment, they often needed help to rise. As the column moved forward again, they hobbled painfully, their faces twisted in discomfort from chafed feet and aching limbs. But they trudged on, driven by the promise of reaching camp for the night, or by the sharp command to form into battle lines, even if it meant double timing into position. Before describing the wagon trains that were an essential part of every army, I will briefly mention Grant's military railroad. This was a railroad built specifically for the Army and used exclusively by it. When the Army of the Potomac reached Petersburg, City Point on the James River became the Army headquarters and the base of supplies, where provisions were brought from the north and distributed to the Army. The Lynchburg or South Side Railroad connected to Petersburg from the west, and a short railroad, called the City Point Railroad, linked it to City Point, 10 miles east. Most of this 10-mile stretch fell within Union lines after the Army reached Petersburg. As the siege progressed and the lines extended westward, Grant proposed building a railroad inside the fortifications to save time and reduce the strain on mule teams while distributing supplies along the lines. This plan was quickly realized. About 5 miles of the existing City Point Railroad were used, and a new line extended southwest for 10 miles, connecting to the Weldon Railroad, which had been seized from the enemy. From there, trains ran 3 miles down the Weldon line before branching off to a new 2-mile spur that reached the left of the Union lines. Supply stations were established along the route, serving troops in the vicinity. These stations were named after various generals. Meade and Patrick's stations stand out in my memory, as my company was stationed near both at different times. Initially, the trains traveling this route were visible to the enemy when crossing open plains, which drew enemy artillery fire. Though no significant damage was caused, the shelling made the trips uncomfortable enough that a high earth embankment was constructed to shield the trains from view. This embankment still stands as a testament to the labor of the pick and shovel brigade. The railroad was a surface-level track, meaning no significant cuts were made to the landscape. When marshes were encountered, trestles were constructed instead of filling them in. The trains navigating this line presented a picturesque scene, winding serpentine-like across the landscape, appearing as though they had jumped the tracks and were making their way cross-country. While the railroad was a valuable innovation, the Army primarily relied on wagon trains for transportation. Despite their importance, wagon trains are rarely mentioned in war histories. The focus on the men in action often overshadows the logistical backbone of the Army. Yet, without these trains supplying essential provisions, an army would quickly become ineffective. In this way, an army is like a machine, with each part indispensable to the whole. The Army wagons were sturdy, practical vehicles built for durability. Each wagon was equipped with a toolbox at the front, a feed trough at the back that could be mounted lengthwise on the pole in camp, a spare pole suspended on the side, a wooden water bucket, an iron grease bucket hanging from the rear axle, and a canvas cover. When fully closed, the wagon resembled a serviceable close carriage, though it was far from a luxury vehicle. Riding in one was a jolting experience. During the winter of 1863-64, while the 3rd Corps was stationed at Brandy Station, my company's concert troupe was hired for evening performances at a stockade near Culpeper. To travel the 4 or 5 miles, we used an Army wagon drawn by mules. The rough terrain and frozen ground ensured the experience was unforgettable. The $7 we earned each night barely compensated for the physical toll of the ride. Many New England regiments were fortunate, or well prepared, enough to bring their own transportation. These included about 25 wagons per regiment, 2 for each company, and 5 for regimental headquarters. Initially, the wagons were drawn by 4 horses, later replaced by 6 mules. A light artillery battery typically had 3 wagons. These vehicles were loaded with everything from tents and stoves to kettles, chairs, and knapsacks, anything that had accumulated in camp. General Sherman vividly described the situation in 1861 near Washington, noting the regiments he saw were burdened with an excess of equipment. Uniforms were varied, arms came in many patterns and calibers, and the baggage required an extraordinary number of wagons to move. Bakeries and cooking establishments rivaling civilian standards were common in the camps near the capital. As the war progressed, it became clear that such luxuries were impractical for active campaigning. Orders were issued to reduce the number of wagons and eliminate unnecessary items. For example, McClellan's 1861 orders prohibited soldiers from riding in wagons, limited knapsacks to those approved by medical officers, and banned the use of tent floors unless specifically recommended for hospitals. Over time, large tents were replaced by shelter tents, stoves were abandoned for campfires, and many comforts disappeared. Despite these measures, managing wagon trains remained a challenge. Early in the war, regiments often had individual trains, creating logistical nightmares. During the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, trains were assigned to brigades, but this caused delays as the roads became impassable from heavy use. Soldiers spent hours escorting overloaded wagons filled with ammunition, provisions, and tents, while the sounds of teamsters shouting at their struggling animals often continued long after the troops had settled into camp. In some cases, wagon trains had to move together, creating chaotic scenes. With no clear marching order, units competed for the lead, leading to shouting matches, threats, and occasional violence. The train that could handle the roughest terrain often emerged ahead, but not without a struggle. That concludes the 11th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.